things that we've been doing in our research is really thinking more broadly about academic outcomes. We've spent a lot of time focused on grades, test scores, and schools of education do a lot of that. We want to know what kids are learning. But what we begin to do is to really think about what are adolescents doing during adolescence? What should they be doing? And one of the chief things that adolescents do is figure out who they are. They spend a lot of time on identity development. And they spend a lot of time just figuring out who they are and experimenting and exploring and taking risks so they can figure out where their boundaries are. And so a lot of the things that we've been doing in our research team is really figuring out what are some of the other things we should be paying attention to besides academic achievement, besides grades and test scores and graduation rates that you hear about in the news so much. We've been looking at things like aspirations, like, you know, what do they want to be when they grow up? What are their educational goals? But what we found with that is that sometimes you can get youth to link their educational or occupational aspirations to what they're doing in school. And once they can see that connection, then school takes on new meaning. Suddenly, there's a reason to persist in the calculus class because it's a means to an end. There's a reason to do the mundane things because it's connected to something bigger into their future. Okay, so this evening we're going to talk about how teens view the job market and how it impacts school engagement and the role of parents in schooling. And I come at this work as one who studies parenting. I study parenting, I study the goals that parents have for their children, I study how children come to make sense of their own goals and their own aspirations. One of my favorite psychological processes is internalization. So how individuals come to take something as their own, to believe in it for themselves. And parents and teachers are key in children coming to understand who they are, what they believe in, and what they want to be. So have you talked to a teenager recently about their future? Figuring out what you want to do, for kids to figure out what they want to do, can be stressful. It can be anxiety provoking, and it can also be exciting and full of promise. But it's all of those things at the same time. Sometimes parents don't think kids are really thinking about the future. Are you really thinking about your future? Don't you know you need to do fill in the blank and stop doing fill in the blank and focus? But what parents really want to feel like is something like this. That in an ideal world, parents want to talk to their kids about the future. But parents are anxious about it sometimes, and kids are anxious about it sometimes. But then it's also filled with a lot of possibility. So one of the things that we've been doing in our research is really thinking more broadly about academic outcomes. We've spent a lot of time focused on grades, test scores, and schools of education do a lot of that. We want to know what kids are learning. But what we begin to do is to really think about what are adolescents doing during adolescence? What should they be doing? And one of the chief things that adolescents do is figure out who they are. They spend a lot of time on identity development. And they spend a lot of time just figuring out who they are and experimenting and exploring and taking risks so they can figure out where their boundaries are. And so a lot of the things that we've been doing in our research team is really figuring out what are some of the other things we should be paying attention to besides academic achievement, besides grades and test scores and graduation rates that you hear about in the news so much. We've been looking at things like aspirations, like, you know, what do they want to be when they grow up? What are their educational goals? But what we found with that is that sometimes you can get youth to link their educational or occupational aspirations to what they're doing in school. And once they can see that connection, then school takes on new meaning. Suddenly, there's a reason to persist in the calculus class because it's a means to an end. There's a reason to do the mundane things because it's connected to something bigger into their future. So we've done a lot of studies where we're looking at even how youth figure this out. So sometimes they get involved in school, they get involved in activities, and that drives what their aspirations are. And sometimes their aspirations become motivating. But over time, we have found that almost every kid knows how to answer the question of what do you want to be when you grow up? Or they know how to answer the question of, do you want to go to college? They all say yes. And so it became this, how do they then see going to college as an end to something or having personal meaning rather than being a goal in and of itself? So what we're finding is kids saying, yeah, I want to go to college. And something like, in some of the national data sets, something like 80% of American 8th graders say they want to go to college. And we know that by the age of 26, even 30, only something like 30% of the US population actually has a college degree. So you have these kids who know they want to go. In some reasons, they lack the preparation or they lack the support, but how do they connect this goal of going to college to something that's more meaningful to them? So we've begun to look at things like imagining a meaningful future. Different from a career aspiration, different from a goal, an educational goal, what is something that you're doing or you're thinking about that draws meaning, that you can imagine a meaningful future? Not a future as a fill-in-a-blank career, but a future that has meaning for them, something that's bigger than themselves, something that gives themselves purpose, something that benefits society so that they can see themselves connected to something larger than who they are. And some of my colleagues out at the University of California, Los Angeles, has looked at this over time vis-a-vis the economy. And that in times of recession and economic downturn, this sense of meaning and meaningful purpose, sense of purpose and meaningful future becomes more salient for youth than jobs that seem fleeting. That making money becomes less significant than having a job that gives meaning to their life. They become more social justice oriented, more community minded, and less focused on individual careers. And so what we've begun to look at is how then do we support youth in thinking about and identifying this meaningful future for themselves and being oriented towards that rather than a career goal or in addition to a career goal, or then imagining meaningful work that they can do that's attached to this goal, that's not just I want to go to college or I want to be some sort of career, labeled career, but something that's deeply meaning. And we've also looked at what we can really examine in adolescence because of differences in the way in which teens can think and reason because of their brain development. We've begun to look at things like cognitive engagement as an outcome, not as a process. But are the things that they're learning in school and in the meaning they're making of it, is it making them plan better? Is it helping them to think about their options and to make good decisions? Is it helping them to think about the broader context in which they do their work? And so we've begun to look at a broader set of outcomes rather than just grades and test scores and things like that. And you can feel free to interrupt with questions if you want. Okay. Yeah.
This might be an obvious question, but what are we defining as teenagers?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, as I teach a class on adolescent development, and the question is, what are we defining as teenagers? And teenagers in this study, and these sets of studies, are people who are in middle school and high school. So some of the studies I'll talk about tonight are mostly high school students. But really, adolescence begins biologically very young in some youth. Other people think we should think about the beginning of adolescence more socially constructed, whether it's the beginning of middle school or some social constructions. And then the end of adolescence is hotly debated, whether or not adolescence ends and a new stage of emerging adulthood begins, or you see a lot in the popular press about the expansion of adolescence into early adulthood or into the 20s as people are still figuring out who they are and what they want to be, and are doing some of the tasks that we often associate with adolescence. But in these studies, we're really talking about middle and high school students. Other questions? So goals and purpose and context. One of the things that we haven't done in this field is not just think about who kids are and the identity that they're developing, but how do they make sense of the context in which they are doing this meaning making and goal setting? So one of my favorite contexts, how can we get retrained if we never got trained? Are our youth making sense of the economy in which they're entering? Are they making sense of job prospects? What do they think about job prospects? How do they make sense of the media that they're hearing about in terms of the downturn of the economy and making sense of unemployment rates and job insecurity? How are they making sense of that? And is it impacting how they think about school, how they think about their goals? And so in this study that I'm going to talk about tonight, we have been surveying high school students for the last 4 years. And we're asking questions about not only their sense of purpose and their well-being and their goals and things like that, but we're asking them about their views of the job market, how scarce they think jobs are, how unstable they think the job market are, and we're calling this together a sense of pessimism, job market pessimism. And what we found is that when you look over time across high school, and there are about 700 or 800 students in this data set that we followed, and what we're finding is that 10th grade ends up being a very tender and at-risk time. That so often that we will see school districts that will focus on the entry into high school, 9th grade, get kids settled. They'll focus on 11th and 12th grade as they're doing college planning and career planning. But what we're finding is that for perceptions of job market scarcity and instability, it peaks at 10th grade. So at 10th grade, they feel that the job market is most unstable and that jobs are most scarce. So we went in and we did focus groups and some qualitative interviews with some of these students to figure out what are they, how do they make sense of this? We showed the findings back to them. But before I talk about that, we saw that it was not just about the job market that we were seeing that 10th grade was a particularly risky time. We saw there was also a decline of college-going efficacy, which is the sense that people feel like they can get into college and succeed in college. That too declined over time. Kind of like you described in the beginning, the closer they got, the more insecure they feel about it. So just at the time when they should be really thinking about college, they're most insecure about it. We have a significant drop-off between 9th and 10th grade in college-going efficacy. We also see it in well-being, that there's a significant decline between 9th and 10th grade that stays low in adolescents' well-being. And also in the importance of schooling, how important they think schooling is for reaching their goals. And so when we went in and we talked to youth about these findings, we showed it to them. We actually talked to some of our undergraduate research assistants because it surprised us, but it didn't surprise them. You know what they told us? Do you know what happens in 10th grade? It's a long time ago for me. What happens? Well, there's the MCAS, which is important. So the MCAS, so for many students across the country, 10th grade is the last standardized test they take in their state that dictates whether or not they can graduate from high school. In 10th grade, what else happens?
The PSATs.
They're taking the PSAT, some of them. So some of them are, for the first time, are seeing how they stand vis-a-vis people just like them across the country.
They start talking to their guidance counselors about what they're going to do after high school.
It turns out the one thing they're not doing is talking to their guidance counselors. Because the guidance counselors are focused on the 11th and 12th graders, and they're focused on the 9th graders, getting them situated into high schools, but they're not talking to their guidance counselors. So they're taking this test that has significant implications for graduating from high school. And if they're not taking that test, or they are taking that test, if they're not worried about that test, they might be taking the PSAT, which is the first time giving them a real sense of what their stakes are and their chances are of going to college. The other thing that's happening is now they're in a much bigger place where they've told now everything counts, everything matters. And for the first time, they might be figuring out whether or not the grades that they've earned in their 9th grade classes are going to land them in the AP course that they hope to get into. So they're getting some real feedback on some of the gateway courses that will either get them into their career or get them into their profession. So they're getting some real feedback. And of the grades that are least likely to know who their guidance counselors are is 10th grade. Not only are they not seeing them, they don't even know who they are. And so they're getting all of this information, feedback information about whether or not they can make it in their goals, whether or not they need to revise their goals at a time when the adults around them aren't necessarily paying attention. The other thing we saw was some variations across ethnic background in this study. In the green and the red bar, what we're seeing are the African Americans and the Asians. And they are more concerned about the job market than are the whites and the Latinos. When we look at their sense of purpose, the Asians, which is the green bar, are much more likely to have a commitment to sense of purpose, followed by the red bar with the African Americans and the purple and Latinos. And the whites are least likely to have a committed sense of purpose. So we looked at commitment to a sense of purpose, engagement in their purpose, and exploration. Interestingly, for the whites, we see that they have a low level of commitment to a sense of purpose, but they perceive themselves as engaging their sense of purpose. But what's also interesting here is that you see that the African Americans have a strong sense of commitment to purpose, but they're least likely to be engaged in the activities that will pursue their purpose. Now, these aren't necessarily school-based activities. We're asking them about their sense of purpose. It's not academic. It's broader than that. And so it could be, we're even asking them if they're engaged in things that are outside of schooling. So when I think about potential targets to interventions, we often focus on getting you to have these goals or have this sense of purpose. But in this case, we also need to think about how to help them engage their sense of purpose and pursue it. So it's not just about having a sense of purpose, but then engaging it. When we looked at educational goals and school importance, we saw that the Asians and the blacks had the higher levels of educational goals and slightly higher levels of school importance. And so kids are still thinking that school is important, but they're also very concerned about the job market. I'll pause here for questions, thoughts, reactions. Yeah. Say again?
Why do you think the Asians are concerned about the job market? I mean, I guess I can understand blacks because there's a higher unemployment rate in blacks than Asians, but I don't think that the Asians and whites, they tend to have a higher employment rate and might have a better perspective of the belief that they would be able to get jobs.
It's not clear the source of what's driving it. We're looking at some of the different things that, in terms of family relationships and teacher relationships, but it's unclear whether or not the concern is directly related to, say, unemployment rates or to other kinds of perceptions around the job market. Yeah.
I think it's the culture, how we're raised, so we just tend to stress out over it a lot. So my question was, how did you measure commitment and engagement? Is it a subjective measurement, or is it like a certain?
We ask, so the question is, how did we measure commitment and engagement? It's a survey questions where we ask them questions like, I have a sense of purpose that defines who I am. To know me, you must have a sense of what my purpose is. There's something bigger than me that gives meaning to my life. We ask those kinds of questions about purpose. In terms of engagement with a sense of purpose, we ask questions like, I'm involved with activities that give meaning to, that help me pursue my purpose or give meaning to the kinds of work that I do. That we're asking them directly about being involved in activities or seeking out people or relationships or things like that in terms of being involved in pursuing their purpose. Good question. Yeah.
Is there any break? I don't know if you'll get to this, but I'd be curious about kind of household economics impact on this versus ethnic
So the question is it really economics rather than ethnicity? And we examined socioeconomic status measured both in terms of parents' education level and with eligibility for free or reduced price lunch, and ethnicity was the bigger driver than socioeconomic status. Other questions? The y-axis is just the standardized scale. It's a scale that we average that runs from 0 to 1 to 5. Yeah.
To the last question, of the students that you interviewed,
Say again.
to the last question, of the students that you interviewed, was there a wide range in the economic?
Yes, you mean the follow-up interviews, or you mean these?
I mean, just in general, were these from affluent?
These are, oh, I see what you're saying. So the sample is on average, a lower middle to higher working class sample on average, with a pretty wide range. This sample reflects the entire high school student body of a mid-sized city. And we were able to collect data from the entire student body, so it's not a sub-sample of a population. And so it ranged from, I think we looked at the data, there are families, who didn't graduate from high school. There are people who have, doctorates whose kids go into the school. It's a very wide range, but it's a working to lower middle class community.
Is it both public and private school?
It's all of the public school students in this community. Yeah.
So does the data all come from one particular city, or is that just an example of how much?
These particular data come from one city, but we've replicated it in other cities. And then as we follow them over time, we're seeing some of the same kinds of patterns. Yeah.
I'm not sure how to word this, but when you're talking about sense of purpose versus career, what is the connection you're making there? Because I know a lot of people feel like they have a sense of purpose that is not necessarily job related.
That's exactly the distinction we were trying to make. That a lot of our earlier research was looking at an aspiration or career goal or educational goal. And what we were finding is that particularly with educational goals is that youth know what the right answer is. They know they're supposed to tell you that they want to go to college when you ask them. And part of what we're looking at here as we're following this sample over time is that this particular school district is very concerned about the transition from high school to post-high school life, particularly for the group of students that are in the mid-range of their school that apply to four-year colleges and get in, and then something happens over the summer and they don't go. Or they get in and they go that first year, and then something happens by the end of that first year that they don't stay on to either the second semester or the second year. And so part of our hypotheses in the larger study is that if this sense of purpose or deeper meaning is attached to what they want to be when they grow up, then we might see greater persistence in that transition post-high school and into college, is what our general goals are. Is that it's not just about saying I want to go to college, because so often for schools they'll set that up as the goal. We are looking at how many kids apply, how many kids get in, and how many kids go. And then getting there becomes the goal. And then they get there, and the kids are like, well, now what? And if your kids, like youth in this community, where financial aid becomes a problem, and universities are very good about giving money to get you there that first year. And the second year, sometimes the scholarships and the financial aid isn't as much as the first year, so they can't go back. So they need something else that's going to keep them there other than my goal was to get to college. And now that times are tough, I don't even know why I'm here. And so we're trying to look at this, at the development of the sense of purpose and envisioning a meaningful future as a way to help youth find themselves in the goals that they're attempting to achieve.
To speak to the point about the first study you did about students being concerned about the economy, does that tie into rising college costs and expenses and the possibility of whether they qualify for financial aid or how they're going to get it? I mean, was that factored into this, or do you think that kind of influenced?
When you say factor into it, it's separate from. So we're looking at this idea of why we wanted to look at job market scarcity and instability and what we're really calling their perception of or pessimism about the job market, because it does impact how they think about the value of education. And in this school district, and data that I'm not going to show you in these slides today, the youth are talking about, well, maybe college isn't worth it. You know, they see the news that talks about people who have such high college debt that it swallows the rest of their life in their early adulthood. And so they're beginning, so if they're in the middle, they're trying to figure out, well, is it even worth it to go to college? And what would make it worth it? And if you're in a school where everybody goes to college, then everybody goes to college. But if you're in a school where not everyone goes to college, you have a significant portion of students who are making this judgment about whether or not it's worth it. And that's part of the calculation of not coming back after the first year. Because now they have a year of potential debt, a year of savings spent, a year of parental investment, and they're like, if I can't see the meaning in it, am I making a good logical decision to drop out? Now that makes my heart wince at the thought of it, because I would want people to go to college, but are they making a good decision? And they're making that calculus. And so part of the other things that we're measuring is college going efficacy and college graduation efficacy. Do they think they can actually finance it? Do they think they can actually achieve in college? Yeah.
A few years back, I signed up for Big Brother Big Sister.
I'm sorry?
A few years back, I signed up for Big Brother Big Sister.
Uh-huh.
And I specified, I asked them for a older child, I guess you can call it, because I was like, well, I don't know how to play, so the only value I can bring to the table is maybe help them figure out, you know, what they want to do after they graduate high school, and what their purpose is when they're trying to figure out what they're doing in college, right? So we had some very, very insightful, deep conversations, and she came from, I mean, like her single parent, but then her mom was totally on it, you know? But it was like, she did tell me, she's like, it's easier to talk to you because you're not my mom. Even though my mom's great, it's like, there's an amount of pressure when you're talking to a parent versus talking to a, sister by choice, you know? And I think we should maybe invest in programs like that.
You're exactly right, and it's not, and what she described, in case you couldn't hear, she described a mentoring relationship that she has with a young lady who talked about how it was easier to talk to her about these future goal things than to talk with her parents. And that's not surprising, because youth actually need other adults in their world that will affirm who they are, that will talk to them about their goals, potentially say the same things their parents would say, only it's cooler coming from someone else.
Well, we have a lot of questions, and sometimes they're afraid to ask. You kind of have to pry it out in the right way. Like sometimes they want to put a brave face in because they know the parent needs to invest in them, and they're worried about that, right? So it's like a little bit of it is pressure, obligation, and like and they don't want to voice. They're not as open in a sense.
Parent-adolescent relationships are complicated, and part of having those deep discussions are complicated around what parents expect, implicitly what teens think their parents expect, and complications around feeling that they're disappointing or can they measure up to their parents' expectations. So those conversations are very complex. So what are the next set of things that we looked at is how do we support youth? How do we think about significant relational connections, particularly parental relationships and teacher relationships that help students envision a meaningful future? And does envisioning the meaningful future relate to academic engagement? So if they have a sense of purpose and a vision for a meaningful future, does it actually translate into higher levels of academic engagement or cognitive engagement? And what we found is that indeed it does. And for family support, which includes scaffolding independence around education, linking education to the future, and providing educational advice, we didn't see a direct relationship between those kinds of parenting variables and engagement. What we did see was that when parents supported the development of a meaningful future, that translated into higher levels of engagement. And for teachers, or the school relationships, which includes sense of belonging, teacher-student relationships, and believing that courses are relevant, that was both directly related to engagement and related to their sense of future, of having a meaningful future. And so when you look at focusing on trying to help youth become engaged in school, helping them have a sense of purpose matters. And one of the chief things that parents can do is to talk to them, not about career goals necessarily or goals for going to college, but what gives life meaning? And how does that meaning translate into things they might want to do with their life? Yeah.
So did you do any sort of comparison looking at, what sort of work is currently done in schools and through a family to try and get to the same ends, but doesn't use the middle point of trying to build a vision of a meaningful future? Because it seems like, we could look at this and say, there seems to be this causality, but like how much better is it than what's going on now that substitutes something else for the meaningful future that's, maybe a little bit more, like dry and or, outdated, but, that gives us some perspective for how much more valuable this is.
We didn't do a direct comparison of this model with several other models in these data. But what we have looked at is in the theory and in our prior research around looking at, again, particularly goals and aspirations around educational goals, around occupational goals, those kinds of other kinds of things that would drive engagement. In looking at those kinds of data, we see that this model fits better in terms of being the next kind of step. We looked at this model, at these data, with aspirations in the middle of the model, educational goals in the middle of the model, and it doesn't fit as well as having a sense of a meaningful future. So what about students' view of the job market? How does that play a role? And here the relationship is somewhat more complicated, especially for the role of parents. And here we see that the school relationships, the teacher relationships, and the sense of belonging, high levels of belonging and teacher-student relationship quality is associated with lower levels of job market pessimism. High levels of job market pessimism, lower levels of engagement. But for the parents, we see a direct relationship between parenting and engagement, but no relationship between parenting and perceptions of the job market, which surprised us. When we took out the direct effects and just tested the model, without the direct effects between school, family support, and engagement, we found that parent support was no longer related to engagement because we didn't see that direct effect once you account for job market pessimism. And if you'll notice, this negative relationship between job market pessimism and engagement turns to zero when that direct relationship is in the model. So there was something else going on, that there wasn't a linear relationship for how parents support academic engagement when youth are concerned about the job market. And so to probe that, we looked at an interaction. And we asked parents, you know, do you talk to your kids about the future? Of course they talk to their kids about the future. Do you talk to your kids about the job market? Do you talk to them about concerns about the economy? No. We asked, are you concerned about the economy? Yes, parents are.
What's the span of the study? Like what time frame?
We,
What year to what year?
from freshman year to 11th grade.
I mean, are like this is 2016, so how far back?
We began collecting these data in 2012.
Because what I'm suspecting is that the job market has changed very drastically in recent years. So even when the parents are trying to talk to their kids about this, they might not know as much as people that are already, you know, like kind of in transition. You know, usually back then they get a job and they stay in that job for a long time. Now it's totally different. So maybe
We looked at, so the question is are parents' job experience is sufficiently different from what youth are expecting to enter? And we looked at parents' experiences with job market instability, being laid off from work and these sorts of things, and it didn't drive the model a whole lot. It wasn't the thing that was making a difference. But here's what we did find, is that we looked at an interaction between parent support and job market pessimism as it relates to school engagement. So is there something going on that makes parenting practices that seem supportive, educational advice, family support, scaffolding independence, that should be supportive and has been shown in other research to be associated positively with outcomes? Is there something different that's happening when youth are concerned with the job market? And that is indeed what we found. So teens' views on the economy changed the effectiveness of the parenting practices, such that at high levels of job market pessimism, those very parenting practices, scaffolding independence around schoolwork, linking education to the future, educational advice, was associated with lower levels of academic engagement. So when youth were concerned about the economy, these parenting practices were not well received. When youth weren't concerned about the job market, those very same parenting practices were associated with greater levels of achievement and engagement. So when we talked to parents, when we presented these data back to parents in the school district, we just said, you know, what do you think? Are they concerned about the job market? Yes. Are you talking to your kids about the job market? No. Do you know they're concerned about the job market? My kid's silent. And so often that silence gets interpreted as lack of concern or lack of care, lack of forward thinking. And so parents put on the screws. Are you thinking about your future? And it turns out, yes, they are. And they're immobilized by it. And in fact, one of my colleagues down at Clark University used this very same measure of job market pessimism and used it on parents. And what she found was that when parents were concerned about the job market, they used much more controlling parenting behavior than when they weren't concerned about the job market. And that cut across socioeconomic status, it cut across ethnicity. When parents are worried about the job market, They parent very differently in more controlling ways than when they're not concerned about the job market. Yeah.
So is this kind of suggesting, kind of going back to what you were saying before, I think you were saying before that when the job market's tight, when the economy's bad, that students are more idealistic. You said that, right?
Say again? That students are more.
Students are more idealistic in terms of wanting satisfaction as opposed to wanting when the job market's tight, or the other way around.
When the economy is downturned, they're much more likely to go for jobs that have meaning.
So
Then
it
they.
kind of sounds like the students and the parents are kind of opposite in kind of how they see things.
Mm-hmm.
That the parents are kind of like they're more practical, and the kids are more idealistic. I guess is kind of the opposite ends, I guess.
And youth are then saying, gosh, if I can't be sure that I'm going to succeed in this job, or this job isn't going to, for lack of a better phrase, bring me happiness, I better pick happiness that's not tied to something that I can't predict, or something that's not stable. That if I can't count on a job lasting, or if I feel like my chances of getting a job is just better than luck, then why would I throw everything into it? I'm going to pick something that's meaningful. I might pick a job that is less prestigious, but serves my other interests. Or I might be willing, gosh, if everything's risky and there's no secure job, I might as well pursue that risky career because life's a risk anyway. And so at least I'd be happy doing it. And so I think students are making those kinds of judgments around and rejecting the kinds of traditional corporate jobs that people generations ago pursued without even thinking, or assuming that those were the kinds of jobs that were going to bring fulfilling lives. So I think they are making judgments about this, and I think parents are worried about the things that parents worry about. Are they going to be able to succeed? Are they going to be self-sufficient? Are they thinking about the future? And the thing is that they are, but we often think that they're not, that their silence often isn't apathy the way in which we think youth are often apathetic and thinking about their future, or being focused on the present rather than the future. Youth, on average, are thinking about the future, and many of them are worried about it. And when they're worried about it and they're not talking to their parents about it, and their parents are worried about it, then the same kind of practices that could be received as supportive are now simply reminding the youth about how hard it is, or how salient it is that their future is insecure. And so you couple this with the declines in perceptions of the ability to get into college, declines on the importance of schooling to succeed. It all paints the story that youth are in isolation, figuring out how to make sense of the education that they're getting, the future that they have before them. Yeah.
So you mentioned corporate jobs, maybe more academic jobs where analytical thinking, and I'm assuming that more analytical thinking might be a challenge for the student. But have you heard or understood or learned anything about students who might want to do something in the arts, like be a professional musician or be a professional artist, and how hard it is to actually do that and be successful? Their perceptions of failing and just maybe doing something easier that they can attain and be happy?
And that's this kind of idea of so-called safe jobs versus jobs that are really risky. That and risky in terms of being able to succeed in them, whether it's the arts or sports, or the kinds of jobs where the odds are really slim for succeeding. And so often in prior generations, that students would aspire to a safe job, right? One that they feel like there's reasonable expectation that they could succeed and make a living and take care of themselves. And what this job market pessimism, I think, is getting at is that youth are feeling like there aren't safe jobs like that, where, gosh, being the musician or the athlete or, the artist seem to be the risky thing. Well, that's no more risky than a bet I might lay on a college education that's going to cost me $200,000. The adults around them should be helping them make these decisions. But what we're finding in our data is that that when they're making a lot of these decisions between 9th and 10th grade, they're not doing it in conversation with adults around them, which is really interesting when you look at the findings around the relationship between teachers and that sense of job market pessimism. That the parents' support wasn't reducing the pessimism, but their sense of belonging at school, their relationships with teachers, were reducing that sense of pessimism. And again, we didn't tie their sense of pessimism to actual unemployment numbers and these sorts of things. It really is their perception of what they see the job market for themselves. And teachers and other adults in the school have the potential to help mitigate or help navigate those potential pitfalls around job market instability. There's some other research that shows in recessions and economic downturn, those students that have what the researchers call a crystallized identity or crystallized goal, like they knew exactly what they wanted to be and they knew how to get there and they knew the pathway, they were much more likely to succeed than the ones who are still figuring it out. And adolescence is all about figuring it out. But so we need to come alongside them as adults who care, teachers and guidance counselors and mentors who care, to help them sort out and find this pathway that gives meaning to their lives in a way that will help them, that will sustain them when they have perceptions of the job market or the actual job market becomes untenable, or as they're making decisions about the value of a college education. Yeah.
So you talked about how what you've looked at really is more perception of the job market than like, you know, unemployment numbers or actual economic statistics. But I'm curious because, so it seems like you're pointing to job market pessimism as a really important driving factor, and that at least a lot of the time high levels of job market pessimism is particularly problematic because it kind of drives the circle with the parental interaction. But it seems like, you know, it's certainly also plausible that low amounts of job market pessimism could also potentially be problematic if someone's, you know, not concerned at all. They think it's easy to get a job. Like, we could see other problems arise, I would think. And so I'm kind of curious if you've thought at all about or looked at, like, comparing somehow job market pessimism to actual economic data in trying to understand, like, maybe not how pessimistic are these kids, but how realistic are they based on, you know, what the current conditions are and what kind of job market they want to go into?
Right, and in looking at these data, which are in a community about a community, it's hard to look at the validity of their perceptions of the job market vis-a-vis real job market numbers. Because if we're looking at the job market numbers in their community, everyone would have the same value. And so we'd really be looking at a variation of error around students' perception of actual numbers. But I would wonder, is it really the reality? Are they really reading the paper and analyzing the numbers around the job market and unemployment and employment rates and jobs that are available in their community? Or is it really the story that they're spinning from it and the perceptions that they have about it and the hype that's around it? Is it that's driving it, which is really what we're measuring, rather than an actual analysis of the reality of the job market? And it's one of the advantages of this data set is that it's actually asking youth what they think about the job market. And to date, there's no study that's actually asked youth what they think about the job market. And I think the next step is then to say, okay, on a national sample, how does that map onto real numbers? And then what do they think is real numbers? Do we use different numbers across different economic groups or cultural groups and these sorts of things? Because that's part of the media as well. So it doesn't surprise me that, for example, the African Americans think the job market is more scarce because on average unemployment rates are higher. Do they know that unemployment rates are higher? Do they know how much higher? Is that what we're seeing there? It's hard to tell. So I think the first step in this is to really say, gosh, are youth operating in a vacuum around these goals, or do they actually have some assessment, anxiety, fears, lack of concern around the job market?
Right. So I don't think necessarily that, or I didn't mean to suggest that looking at those economics statistics should be necessarily like more of a driver. That I think the perceptions are pretty hard to model, to understand like how did kids actually come to believe what they believe about the job market, and that looking at unemployment statistics probably won't explain that much of it. But my motivation for the previous question was just in thinking about like how to come up with some change that we can make based on the findings that you have on the slide right now, because that would kind of suggest that, well, parents should, or schools or whoever else has influence should try and consistently drive students to low levels of job market pessimism, because it means these other things that we do are more effective when students have low.
I don't think it's so much to say that that the goal should be to make everyone believe that the job market isn't challenging. I think the goal is to look at this as pessimism rather than reality. So how are they making sense of it? Like, you can be in a field where there's a low probability of success and feel like I have a plan. I know how I'm going to navigate this, and feel that you have some efficacy around navigating that. So I don't think the answer is necessarily to get all the students to believe that the job market is in their favor. I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal of these findings is not, again, to drive that down, but to help parents and schools to say, have the conversation about youth's concerns about the larger economy. And again, in a room full of 500 parents, when I asked them if they were concerned about the job market, 75% of them raised their hand, that they were concerned about the job market for their kids. And then I said, how many of you have talked to your kids about it? Almost none. Having the conversation is the first step, even if you're not trying to drive, like I'm looking to drive down this number and down to 0 is the best outcome. I think what it really is saying is have this conversation, because youth are thinking about it, and it's impacting how they're thinking about their future, and it's impacting their academic achievement.
I think it's also a reaction of what they do when they're pessimistic. Because some people would give up, other people would double down. And other than, talking is important, and I'm just thinking if there's ways where you can help them apply, maybe like shadow like certain programs that allow you to come and go on tour, certain companies, and give them something tangible to them.
So you're really giving them a pathway. And I think part of it is, if we go back to this slide here, is really figuring out how to explain or mitigate that relationship between job market pessimism and academic engagement. So how do we break that connection? So even if the job market is poor, how do we help youth stay engaged in school and maintain a sense around the value and importance of schooling? Because at the end of the day, graduating from high school and graduating from college does increase the chances that one will be gainfully employed. We know that. But when they're at this age, how do we help them think about and navigate their calculations around the value of education in general, their efficacy to succeed in college, their sense of importance, and how they value education? Yeah.
I mean, I don't remember my guidance counselor years, but are there these kind of conversations happening with 11th and 12th graders when they are making these decisions about the financial impact, or is that rarely?
What's often happening in 11th and 12th grade is that preparation for either college or career readiness. That they really aren't still having that conversation around a sense of purpose and how they're perceiving the job market. It really is about how do we get you into college. And schools still judge themselves on how many graduate and how many go on to college and what colleges that they're going to. And that's still one of the key indicators of a successful high school is not whether or not their youth come away fulfilled, sense of a meaningful future, but whether or not they graduate and go on to college. And few schools then even track whether or not their kids that graduate actually finish college.
But is there a conversation around the financial impact of attending? Because you mentioned that as kind of being an outcome, that can impact pessimism. The perception of pessimism is, well, yeah, it costs a lot of money, but I can make X more than that.
So are they doing this financial calculus of how much more they can make if they go to college than if they don't? And they aren't, on average. Guidance counselors aren't having that kind of calculation. They're trying to get them into college and get them the best financial package. But are they talking to them about how do you think about the debt you're taking on to go to a particular college? And does that make sense? People spend more time thinking about their car loan applications and debt than they do around college debt. And so on average, of course there's some here and there that do this, but on average, guidance counselors aren't having that kind of discussion about how to finance college, how to think about the value of college, how to navigate the price of private colleges and universities via public colleges and universities and what they get out of them in the end. On a national stage, we're not having that conversation, but it's an important one to have. And it feeds into this sense, potentially this sense of pessimism around the job market, is that students are in our studies will talk about, well, I know this person and this person and this person who went off to college, now they've graduated from college and they don't have the job that they thought they were going to have, but now they can't buy a home because they have student loan debt. And students can recount those stories as a way of saying, well, maybe I don't want to go to college. Well, if I don't want to go to college, well, why am I pursuing this? You can see all the ways in which this cycles back. And I'm going to end here.
Great, thank you so much.
I was going to pick up on something that Nina talks about, the problem of training and maintaining an exciting workforce, an excited young workforce. And I'd just like to say that I've been a neuroscientist since my first days of graduate school, and in some ways this is the absolute most exciting time for new discovery in the brain, partially because of new technologies that have been developed and partially because of the new technologies that are coming online. So it's a phenomenal time. And at the same time that it's a phenomenal time and is drawing excitement in our young students, and we want to bring them into the field, it is a time of complete despair among a large fraction of our graduate students and postdocs. And more and more of them are leaving the field because, and this is all about money and jobs. So, the NIH and I think funding agencies other places in the world are funding at such low levels that students now think there's no future for me. And so, we have this ridiculous scenario right now, which is the most exciting time for brain research that I can remember. And we're losing the highest fraction of these really excited, talented people that I can remember. And that's all because of money.